This is Bill Wappler, my father. I have chosen to interview him because he grew up during the Vietnam War. He believes that the media's portrayal of the war on the evening news, the radio, and the newspaper affected his perception of the war and also that of his parents. The story he will tell occurred when he was 7 years old in 1968. His parents were planning on going into Chicago for dinner, but opted out when they saw on the news that potentially dangerous protests would occur during the Democratic National Convention. This protest was one of the largest that occurred during the Vietnam War. Okay, Dad, so describe what you remember from that day in 1968.
Sure. So we lived in Evanston, Illinois, which was a suburb of Chicago, and I was young. I was about 7 years old, and my brother Andy was 4, and my parents were going out into the city with some friends of theirs for a dinner, and it wasn't that often that they'd go out, so it was kind of an unusual event in itself, and we had a babysitter coming by. And I remember my parents and their friends, the Stalls, that afternoon they were speaking to each other and they decided to cancel. And the reason they decided to cancel is that they were worried about the potential for protests against the war that would mess up the traffic and or just make it difficult to get to the restaurant. So they stayed home that night. I remember we watched it on TV, and it turned out to be, unfortunately, a very severe protest. I think 15,000 protesters, and Chicago police brought out something like 10 or 12,000 police officers, and the TV just showed constant scenes of protesters getting clubbed or kicked or punched by the police. So it was quite a brutal night in Chicago, and I remember as a young boy thinking, wow, that was really a big event, and as it turns out with history, I think it did prove to be a big event.
Dad, do you believe that what the information provided by media on the evening news or the radio or newspapers affected your parents' decision not to go in that night and affected their opinion on what the war protests were like?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely had a big impact on them. I think that the pictures they saw on TV of other protests that had happened in the summer of 1968 made them quite fearful. And in this case, I think it turns out they were, justified. This was a pretty large protest.
Do you remember seeing images or videos of protests on the news, and do you remember how you felt about them?
I definitely remember seeing the protests on TV. Um, I was still pretty young. I was 7 years old. I can't honestly remember whether I had any strong emotional feelings other than I could tell this was something that was, a big deal and that it was causing concern for my parents.
So, Dad, in 1972, when the presidential election was coming around, um, how do you remember to what extent the Vietnam War played a role in that election, and how your opinion and that of your parents had changed with the Vietnam War by then, 4 years later?
Sure, I remember the election very well. I was, 11 years old and in sixth grade, and I remember many of my classmates and kids in the class would debate, whether it be voting for Nixon or for McGovern. And my parents were going to vote for McGovern, and I would tell people that at school, and I would say that we're voting for McGovern because we want to end the war sooner. That was a big part of McGovern's campaign, and there were other kids in school whose parents were, I think, telling them the same thing. But a lot of the kids in school, still probably the majority in the town we lived in, were going to vote for Nixon because he was the Republican candidate.
So, Dad, do you think that your parents' opinion and perception of the war changed by 1972, at least in part due to the influences that the media had on them?
Yeah, I think if you look at my parents, in the mid '60s and late '60s, they were, I would say, a fairly conservative Republican type couple. And, at that point they were in favor of the war because they felt that that was the patriotic thing to do. But by 1972 they were against the war, and our family and our neighbors, we never had anyone directly involved in the war, so their only exposure to the war was from television and the nightly news and seeing images of protests, or seeing pictures in the newspaper of people in Vietnam or Cambodia after the villages had been attacked. And these images, these news stories convinced my parents that the war had no purpose and wasn't a just war, and therefore by 1972 they were no longer in favor of it.
So, Dad, you remember seeing the image of the napalm girl on television and discussing it with your parents, correct?
That's right, Matt. That was June of '72. So I was 11 years old, and I remember when that image of the little girl and her other brothers and sisters running down the street after the napalm attack, that image was all over the newspapers and the TV as soon as that occurred. And I remember, talking about it with my parents, and I asked them, I said, gee, I thought wars were about, soldiers fighting each other. Why are these kids getting attacked? And my parents, I remember at the time, explained to me that was one of the reasons why they felt this war was not like the other wars our country had been involved in, and that perhaps the country, was not in the right war. We should get out of the war.
Do you think that that image, among others, perhaps influenced your parents' opinion of the war and who they would vote for in the '72 election?
Yeah, I think, I think they already had a pretty good sense of who they're going to vote for, but, seeing a picture like that a few months before the election just reinforced the notion that they felt the war should be ended, and they wanted to vote for the person who would do it soonest.
All right, thank you.